Hello everyone, I'm Maria Quintero, Executive Director here at Bridgepoint. I've been with the company for going on 20 years in a couple months. And this is my third senior community with Kisco, and we are really excited to have you all here today. And I want to introduce you my team. This is Tom Collins, our Dining Services Director, our Sales Director, Michael Toe, and I have Michelle, our Resident Relations Director, Roxanne, our Sales Director, and then I have Jessica, she is our Resident Care Supervisor, and I have Laz, he's our Human Resource. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Maria and team, for having us here. Appreciate all this stuff. You know, Mike Scott, when I told him about this on St. Patrick's Day, he said, well, they have green beer, I'm coming. Well, guess what? They don't have green beer, but he's still here. Okay, folks should be walking in as we get started. Yeah. That's what that was involved too. Okay, everyone, the moment you've been waiting for. We're so excited to have Dr. Sara Zeff Geber here. She's an author, speaker, and retirement coach. Sara was named an influencer in aging in 2018 and is a regular contributor to Forbes.com in the areas of aging and retirement. Sara has a special interest in solo ages. Her book, Essential Retirement Planning for Solo Ages, right over here. I lost one. A retirement and aging roadmap for single and child-free adults was published in 2018 and selected as a best book on aging well by Wall Street Journal. Since early 2020, Sara has been a fellow with Nexus Insights, a think tank advancing the well-being of older adults through innovative housing and healthcare. Sara is active in the American Society on Aging, ASA, the Life Planning Network, and the Encore Network. She frequently speaks about solo aging and senior living at national and local conferences and meetings. And here is Sara.
Thank you for having me today. I was telling Leslie that when I lived down here until 2015, I used to belong to Senior Roundtable, and I came pretty faithfully because I was just starting out at that point in the senior living business and in the industry in general. So it was great to get to know people that way. I now live in Santa Rosa, which is kind of a schlep, so I don't come down for Senior Roundtable anymore. All right, so solo aging. What is it? How did I get started in it? Sometime around 2011, I was having a glass of wine in one of those little wine bars in Palo Alto with my friend Sandy. And she had been spending the whole year running back and forth to the East Coast, and I wanted to know what was going on. I knew her parents lived back there because that's where she was raised. And I said, well, what's the deal? I've hardly seen you this last year. She said, well, you know, I've been taking care of my mother. She's, all of a sudden she can't drive, and now she's having trouble getting groceries, and I had to have arranged for some live-in care finally, and this last trip we decided that she'd probably be better off in some kind of senior community. So then we had to get her moved, and then I had to clean out her house, and then I had to sell the house. So she spent more time on the East Coast than on the West Coast. And I looked at her at one point and I said, Sandy, you and I don't have kids. Who's going to do that for us? And that was the question that launched the rest of my career. And and the question that I have been answering both for myself and for the rest of the millions of solo agers that are out there. So that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today, and from a perspective that many of you work with solo agers, and some of you are solo agers. So I hope that you'll look at this from both perspectives, especially, and even if you aren't a solo ager, I doubt you have a neighbor or a family member or someone that you couldn't think of that is one. So let me talk a little bit more about it and define it for you. When I started looking into how widespread this was, because I thought, well, Sandy and I are not the only two solo agers around. I work with a lot of women who I know never had kids, and some of them aren't married. And so I started looking at the statistics. And what I found was a pretty startling rise in childlessness between the previous generation and the baby boomers. With the baby boomers, the rate of childlessness almost doubled. In all previous generations, childlessness was about 10% because that was about the rate of infertility. But with the baby boomers, I'm getting out of range. With the baby boomers, that went way up. Now, think about it for a minute or two. What was going on in the late 60s and all throughout the 70s that might have contributed to that? What do you think?
Birth control.
Yeah, you got it. Birth control, yes. In 1964, the birth control pill became available. That was one thing. What else was going on? Well, the push for equal rights. So women, starting in the late 60s and well into the 70s and beyond, started seeing doors open for them to educational institutions they'd never been able to apply to jobs and careers that had never been open to them. So that led to a lot of women making the decision that motherhood and family and even being a wife might not be good for them. And I was one of them. I decided motherhood wasn't for me. So that's what I'm talking about with regard to childlessness. And actually, a really nice thing happened last summer. The Census Bureau decided to do a measure, if you will. They did some research in their files of how many older adults were childless. And it just reinforced everything that I've been saying. It reinforced all the literature that I've been reading and all the statistics that the Pew Research Corporation had done in 2010. And you can see a result of it up here. That short line over on the right that's not baby boomers. That's generation before us. The middle one is early baby boomers. And the far left one is late baby boomers. So the rate of childless has just been going up like crazy. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, is that all it is? Are solo agers just childless people? No, not at all. In fact, I learned that pretty quickly when I started talking about solo aging, and I had so many people come up to me and say, well, I feel like a solo ager, and I have a child that lives 6,000 miles away, or, et cetera, et cetera. So actually, no. There's a lot of categories that make up solo agers now, in my mind. And it might be someone like my neighbor Judy, who has one son, and he had the nerve to fall in love and marry a Danish woman. Well, guess where they live? They're raising their kids in Denmark near her parents. So was Judy and her husband feel like solo agers? You bet. That's a long way. And they're not going to come rushing home in a crisis. They might be able to get there in 48 hours if they're really, really lucky. So there's a lot of people out there with varying kinds of situations that make them feel like solo agers, even if they do have kids. So what does a solo ager, what does their social network look like? It looks pretty different than a parent. Now, this is a typical social network of someone who has kids, whether they're married or not. And that social network just grows, it just expands through those kids. And pretty soon there are grandkids in most cases, and that just expands it further. So what I've observed is that people who do have a robust family network like this, that's pretty much their entire social network. They don't get as involved with the community and with their friends as some solo agers do. Now, that's not true for everybody. Clearly, everyone has their own unique social network. But this is a typical one for a parent, especially a parent whose kids and grandkids live fairly close by. Now, contrast that with a social network of a solo ager. Notice how the larger lines go to the friends and to the community. If you look at any volunteer group, whether they're working with kids or dogs or whatever, you're going to scratch the surface of that volunteer group and find a lot of solo agers. A lot of people who are adding meaning and purpose to their life, especially people who are retired. So when I talk about solo agers, I'm really talking about people 60, 65 and up. Hence the ager. I have some colleagues that are looking at what they call solos. And yes, we certainly need to start thinking about the fact that we're solo well before we get to the age of 60 or 65. And so she is kind of on a crusade to make sure that people in their 30s and 40s and 50s, depending on their situation, kind of look at starting the planning even then. But I talk about people mostly 60, 65 and up. So, what is it that solo agers need? Well, the best way I found to look at that is to look at what adult children typically do for their parents. Now, how many of you in this room played some kind of role in taking care of your own parents? Okay, good. The rest of you aren't old enough. Anyway. If you, not everybody has that. In fact, one of the reasons that I didn't recognize this phenomenon was that my parents had both passed on when I was in my 30s. And my husband, likewise, had lost his when he was fairly young. So it never occurred to me that there'd be any challenge out there that I might not be facing or friends might be facing. But when you look at what kids do for their aging parents, it's a lot. Now, this may be the one slide that could be a little difficult to read if you're in the back. But you know what's on it if you've taken care of parents. You know all the things that my friend Sandy had to do. Supplying the medications, being the prompt social contact, dealing with finances, dealing with real estate, all of the things that older adults need and find that they often can no longer do for themselves. So for solo agers, the question is, who is going to play that role? So we know that, and you can see it in the work that you do, the most important person in anyone's life as they get older is a spouse or partner, if they have one. And when people are widowed, the greatest task in front of that person, that newly widowed person, is replacing that relationship. I don't mean that they have to get married again or find a new person to essentially live with, but they need to replace that relationship. So one of the things that I caution solo agers about is that they, because they don't have children or they don't have children that are very accessible, they often look to their partner or spouse to be their entire social network. And that is essentially dangerous. Because as we get older, we need to have a social network that is broader than that encompasses more than just the partner. So as you work with people who are solo agers, I hope that you'll encourage them to branch out their social network. Now, when I talk, like, as I did this morning, to a group of retired people, and I think I had a range of about maybe 60-something to 80-something in the room, and I always tell them the same thing, that this is one of the paramount issues that come up for people that are solo agers. Adding to their social network in some way is always, always beneficial. So it's something that those of you who work with clients who are looking at where do I live, how am I going to have my needs taken care of, you're trying to help them find a senior community possibly. That's one of the most important aspects of being in a community is building that social network. So, again, another statement that just kind of reinforces this, and I pulled this out of the literature about 10 years ago. The blood relatives, and it's kind of sobering, really, when you think about it. Blood relatives are the only reliable source of care from a moral obligation. The only morally obligated people to do that. And you know that's true worldwide. People expect that their families to take care of their own. And one of the things we're seeing in this country anyway, and a lot of Western Europe too, is that's just not happening anymore. So as the baby boomers, especially, because we're going to be the first generation that will get up there without a huge preponderance of children that will be available, it's going to be interesting to see what society does to aid in this situation. Now, also, it's important to note, I think, that more childless people live alone. Even if a person is not with a partner or married, people who have kids very often end up living with one of the kids. But that's not true for solo agers. They don't have a child to live with. So they're often living alone, and they're some of the people that are probably the most vulnerable. And they're some of the ones that really need this information. They need to understand what some of their vulnerabilities are as solo agers. So, this is probably not news to you. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of studies going on with regard to isolation. A lot of, I bet I read 24 articles just in our local paper that detailed the findings about what happens when people are isolated, the dangers of isolation, the dangers of loneliness. I know I had an experience of that myself when, I guess it was probably about 2 months into the lockdown. I think it was maybe May of 2020. And I was feeling particularly isolated, even though I had my husband there with me, fortunately, and I was glad to have him. It wasn't the same. I'm a fairly gregarious person. I like to go out and have lunch with my friends. I belong to a book club. I was online with people. I was in Zoom meetings, but I was just feeling really out of sorts and not knowing what to do about it. And I picked up the paper one day, and there was an article about a fellow who lived in Petaluma. Now, the news might have reached down here, too. This fellow in Petaluma went out on his deck at about dusk, and he howled. Just like a wolf that howls to let other wolves know they're in the area or they're found a mate. And pretty soon, you hear howling back. And pretty soon, after 2 or 3 days, a week, his whole community was howling. Well, I thought, you know what, we can do that. So I told my husband, who's a good sport, I said, well, let's go home in our cul-de-sac tonight and howl. So, okay, I had to get him to read the article, but he did. And so we did. We went out of our cul-de-sac at about 8 o'clock in the evening and we started howling. And sure enough, the neighbors came out to see who the nutcases were in the cul-de-sac. And we all started howling. And pretty soon, howling led to talks and led to happy hours. And pretty soon we were doing bring your own everything dinners out in the middle of the cul-de-sac. And it was so wonderful to be able to be with people. Now, we really hadn't known too many of our neighbors because we had only been in that house less than 2 years when the pandemic started. So I was thrilled at the fact that I was even getting to know some of the neighbors that I hadn't yet met walking the dog. So I know for me, having a social network, one that I can reach out and touch and hug and shake hands or whatever I want to do, not just little pictures on the screen, is pretty darn important. And the risks of loneliness and isolation are obviously there, but there are things that we can do about it. These are a list of suggested ways of combating the isolation that may set in as you get older and you're less able to get out and meet people for lunch, or less able to even get yourself to an appointment. Many people have to stop driving, as you know, at some point. And all of these things can help. I know sometimes people say, well, why do you have a dog up there? Well, how many of you have dogs? So you know I have a dog up here, right? Yeah, I love that dog. And well, you don't walk a cat. And a cat's a good companion, and so is a dog. But what's really important about a dog is you meet people when you walk that dog. And I think by the time COVID was over, I knew half of the rest of the neighborhood thanks to the dog. So it's just, it's one of those introductory things. Even though the dog park was closed, we kind of formed our own dog daycare circles, and you do what you have to do. So these are our ways, and there are so many ways that we can stay in touch with people. And it's so important, I think, to encourage your clients to do the same. And of course, it involves all of the estate planning and the financial planning. Some wagers have a more urgent need to do that because they don't have a safety net. Now, some wagers who have kids and they live kind of far away, well, it's sort of a gray area. But those solo wagers that don't have kids, it's not a gray area at all. Those powers of attorney and advance directives and all the other estate planning documents, they need to be watertight. And not only that, you need to communicate about it. One of the things that I see people doing so often is completing those documents and then putting them in their binder, shoving the binder on the shelf, and never telling the people that they named that they're in there. Now that's, to me, it seems ridiculous, but it's true. And attorneys will not usually even mention that. To me, that's kind of common sense. So for yourselves, for your clients, the more you can have the conversations, the better off you'll be in terms of having that safety net that isn't naturally there with kids. Because all of us have a kind of a social system, if you will, a support system that looks like this. All of these components all start out with these components. As you get older, though, some of these components begin to shrink or even go away. And we don't know what order that's going to happen in, but they do. They start disappearing from our lives, or they get smaller. But eventually, if we're not careful, this happens. And I don't know about you, but I don't want the people I pay to take care of me to be the only people in my life. I'd rather my support network look more like this. But if I'm going to have that, I have to work at it. I really have to build it now. I have to make sure that I'm in the right place to have this happen. And again, it takes some work. So the question becomes, usually, for most people, where are you going to live? Now, because you all work in the senior living industry in some way, shape, or form, I'm not going to go through the whole list of what kind of options there are out there for people to live. You know what they are. And I think it's very, very important for solo agers to be in some kind of housing where they're with people. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a lifespan community or a board and care home, unless they get to a point where their health demands it, or assisted living. You know as well as I do that a lot of people resist that kind of conventional congregate living. And at the very least, home sharing, or living somewhere where you're very close to your neighbors and you all know and support each other. Now, Leslie has told me about his involvement in co-housing. I've always been a really big fan of co-housing. My husband and I almost joined the Mountain View co-housing community quite a few years ago when it was just forming. Ultimately, we didn't, and it had to do with our dog at the time, but anyway, that's another story for another time. But I'm a big fan of any kind of congregate living where people are supporting one another. I'm a huge fan of home sharing. The whole Golden Girls model, I think, is wonderful. And you know, when you think back to the Golden Girls, that was actually a multi-generational group. Because at the time, I think I think Estelle Getty was probably in her early 90s. At least late 80s, but the two younger ones, Rupert Lanahan and B. Arthur, were probably only 61, 62. So, and in fact, I think the Estelle Getty character was the mother of B. Arthur character, right? Anyway, it was multi-generational, but we were all young enough then that it looked like a bunch of older women to us. What's the difference? Now there's a difference. So, home sharing is actually kind of taking hold. There are local connections that can be made to find databases where people are looking for housemates. There are also websites. My favorite one is Silver Nest, that allows people to find a homemate anywhere in the country. And they're growing. They have competition. I can't think of the names of the competition right now, but they're growing. So that pretty much wraps up what I want to tell you about with regard to solo aging. This is my book, which is up here and available, but I'd love to entertain some questions now, because we do have time for those. So, do we have any questions locally? Otherwise, I'm going to appeal to the chat. Nothing in the chat. So, local only. What can I answer for you? Yes, Leslie.
So many of us in this industry, we know the big issue is denial. People don't plan until it's too late. How do you talk to some of these people you know are going to need to do the planning?
And Leslie's asking, how do you talk to people about the planning that needs to be done? Because people do resist it. People are in denial. Yes. Denial is my nemesis, denial. You just start. You just start by having a frank talk about, what do you see? in the future? Where do you see yourself living? And if their answer, what it usually will be, is, I'm just going to age in place, that conversation usually starts with, well, okay, let's talk about you aging in place. How do you think you'll do on these stairs? You're already having trouble with your knees. So the deeper you get into the conversation, the more it probably will occur to them, even if they don't say so initially, but it will occur to them that they ought to be considering something. So if you're someone that's listening to this right now and you're thinking about a parent, that's a conversation to have. And again, there's no great way of starting it. It's just like that end of life conversation. There's no great way to start it. But you gotta just plow in. Just jump in and say, what are you thinking about? What are your plans? What are your plans for when you're 80? What are your plans for when you're 90? Yeah. No crystal ball there. I have a question way in the back. Out loud.
What is the role for faith communities?
What is the role of a faith community? That's a great question. I just came from a faith community this morning where I was giving a talk. I think one of the terrific roles of a faith community is gathering together the solo agers in your congregation and starting to meet and starting to talk about what plans need to be made. There's starting to be more and more resources for that. My book is one of them. There are a lot of worksheets in there, but I have colleagues too, who, if you Google solo aging, you'll find people other than me now who are developing resources. Resources can be used in groups where people can reinforce each other and help each other through this. Did I answer your question satisfactorily? Thank you. What else? What else can I answer? Yes?
Oh, no, sorry.
You were just waiting at somebody?
Yes.
It's like an auction, you know, if you get your hand above your ear, I'm not calling you.
Well, I got another one.
Okay, Leslie, that's another one.
I got plenty of questions. One of the things, of course, is the planning, right? You've got someone you assign as the beneficiary, someone that's an advocate who's making these decisions. Is there a conflict of interest that the beneficiary, is making some of these decisions, or maybe they should be making some of these decisions, and not a separate advocate who may be a best friend?
And Wesley's question is there a conflict of interest among people you name? Say you name somebody on your power of attorney that's also going to be a beneficiary in your will. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, but that's no more a hazard for solo agers than it is for families, right?
That's true.
I suspect that many of you have seen members of families try and manipulate people to do things that will be advantageous for them. It's a shame. It's a form of elder abuse, as we know. I think there's ways to be a little careful of that. There's kind of checks and balances. You have backups or name two people that have to coordinate between the two of them when making a decision about your finances or making a decision about your care. I like having, I know in my own case, I have 3 people in every position. My husband's first position, but should he predecease me and I'm out there by myself, then I have a couple people already. And I suspect, unless something happens in the next 6 or 8 years, I suspect we'll do our estate plan again. We've redone it 3 times now. We should do that every 5 to 7 years. 10 years is a little long. We had one person that had made himself unavailable because they moved and another person had died. So we had to redo a lot of ours. And it's important to drag that monster out and look at it every now and then.
So along the same lines, who do you recommend to a sole ager that they take as POA as the candidate?
Great question. Who do you recommend to a solo ager to choose to put on their POA or their advanced directive? It's the question of the hour, isn't it? There's no magic answer to that. However, good candidates are nieces and nephews. Hopefully, one of the things I suggest to solo agers is they develop relationships with nieces and nephews as early as possible, so that you have someone that you know and trust. Now, that depends on whether you do know and trust them. Sometimes they're not accessible. Good friends are candidates only if they're younger. They really, I know people that have named contemporaries on their advance directive and whatnot. You know, they're just as likely to need your help as you need theirs. So at least have backups of younger people. That's another great role for a faith community, is to put people together intergenerationally. Just for that, if only just for that purpose. I know for myself, I have met younger women primarily through groups that I belong to, professional societies, my book club. I meet them in different places, but I do know younger women. And that has been a great source of help to me when I have needed to name people and had a discussion with them. So, yeah, gotta choose younger people. Yes, in the back.
This is fascinating, and I'm so glad you're bringing it forward. And it seems in contrast to the answer you just gave, it's important to know just who's nearby in case you need help immediately.
Yes.
So neighbors seem like they might move, but just get to know your next neighbor. You never know who's going to need something important.
Absolutely. Get to know your neighbors. Nothing more needs to be said. Get to know your neighbors, because you never know. We had a next door neighbor that they're actually younger than we are by about 6 or 8 years, and he had a seizure one night, and the only way we actually knew about it because we saw the fire truck arrive about 5 a.m. He ended up in the hospital. This was during COVID, and we ended up actually doing a lot of maintenance, kind of care for their home while they were gone, because she had to, believe it or not, Kaiser had her stay with him in the hospital. For a lot of reasons, it was very different than their usual protocol, but there was nobody else, so we kind of filled in on the back end with pet care and that kind of thing. So yeah, know your neighbors. And way in the back, you're gonna have to talk really loudly.
So I have a loud voice. I have been a care manager for 16 years, and I've learned one thing. I'm not having my children involved in my care.
Good for you.
And there's a good reason for that. As my other care managers here in the room here understand that sometimes your children don't end up being your best friend. So cultivate younger friends, people who really care about you and who want to do things for you. That's the best thing in life.
I think that's a great suggestion. People have all different sorts of relationships with their kids, don't they? I mean, it's just, there's such a huge variety there. Some people who have kids know absolutely they can rely on them. They have a social network that looked like that spider web that I put up there, that busy looking flow chart. And others look more like solo agers, and their kids just don't live very close, and they're not very close to them, and sometimes they don't even let them. So yeah, based on the situation, do what you can with what you have. That's probably the best advice going out there. I wish I had $1 for every person that I have heard say to me, well, I don't want to be a burden to my kids, but I'm going to age in place. One of the things that I do is that I write a blog. I write a regular blog for Forbes.com. And I wrote a blog last year, and the title was Aging in Place, a great way to exact payback from your adult children. That's not the way I feel about it. Yeah, you're doing your kids no favor. It's just you're saying something totally the opposite when you say I'm not age in place, but I don't want to be a burden on my kids.
So you mentioned co-housing. We've got conventional assisted living, like Bridge Point, and there's board and care homes, there's different kinds of models, but the co-housing model is something that seems like it could be headed in the right direction, especially since the family model is disintegrating. And people can't afford, a lot of people can't afford assisted living, and board and care home isn't necessarily appropriate. So besides the Mountain Views of co-housing, have you seen other initiatives like that?
Well, there are several hundred co-housing communities around the country. A good-sized handful of them here in the Bay Area. And I'm going to guess Wesley knows more about this than I do, so I'm going to refer you to him for further discussion about that. I'm a huge fan of co-housing. I think people supporting each other, neighbors supporting neighbors, taking care of one another, I just think that's so important. It's puzzling to me why people resist that, but yeah. Okay, way in the back in the green sweater. Talk loud.
Oh, yeah. No, so my parents are really funny right now. Tomorrow I'm heading out to Vegas to take care of my parents. My dad, he always said, oh, I got everything taken care of. When I asked him about his future, you got paperwork, you have a power of attorney, all that. Yeah, I had it done. Well, he had aneurysm surgery. So tomorrow I'm going out there because his wife just can't even handle herself. And so, it's just, I take care of people, we're all in this field. I take care of people every day where I'm having this conversation. Then I got my dad who's like, I got it. And I'm like, do you? So then I'm thinking, well, where am I? What kind of a care manager am I? I'm going to take care of my parents. They're big, mind you. They're not right here. But they don't let anybody in. They don't want anybody to do anything. So there's my story there. But what I wanted to actually say is, what happens when you have that person? My parents, I don't know if they can afford it, but what do you do when you have nobody? Absolutely nobody. We're saying, you gotta talk to your neighbors, you gotta trust this person. Get in there with younger people. You can't do that because you don't know who's gonna take advantage of you. You don't know what's gonna happen. You don't know my dad and his wife, they do nothing outside of each other. Nothing.
That's so dangerous.
So is that where fiduciary would come in, right?
A fiduciary can be a good choice. Yep, we're lucky to live in a state that licenses
Care
them.
managers. So, but care managers have always to have power of attorney. That's what I'm thinking, right? Well, yeah. So, that's some new. But I guess I'm looking at it what if something happened to me? I'm an only child, My dad's wife has one son, he's an only child. So there's only two of us. We talk 3 times in our lives.
Well,
So, it's just this, my parents fit exactly what you're talking about.
sure, it sounds like they do, and that was a good story to share about parents that have nothing but each other. And one daughter that lives far away. So a couple things come up as you're talking. And that is, first of all, what was I going to even say to that? It is a great example of people thinking they're prepared on paper, but they're not prepared in real life.
Well, even better, I don't have any idea of what they have written out.
So they've never shared that with you.
No.
Yeah.
So I'll be picking that up tomorrow.
Yeah, good. Find out. Have the conversation. Find out. And there was something else I was going to comment on what you said, but I can't think of it now. And I know there were a couple of other hands in the air. Let's see, first of all, the blue sweater.
A little bit of green in my time.
And a little bit of green, that's a good thing.
Given the epidemic of mistrust and the power of denial, what are the pathways even to initiate conversation? From my perspective, I'm a retired physician, and so I can sometimes do that in the office.
Mm-hmm.
a trustworthy clergy can do that. But that's not necessarily available to everybody. So getting the person's attention enough to listen requires almost a built-in community that they identify with. It takes up a topic.
Yeah, that's why I loved your earlier question about the faith-based community, because that is a community where most people learn to trust a handful of others, or at least the pastor, or minister, or rabbi, or whoever it might be. So, a lot of the questions that you're asking and that you're thinking about asking have no perfect answers. And that's why we're here, to start the discussion among us, so that it will hopefully spread. And that's all we can really do, is to spread this information, try and get these discussions started in your own family, in your own neighborhood, among the people you know. That's really all we can do. Society itself, I worry actually about what's going to happen in about 10 years. Because the lead baby boomers now are about 75. In 10 years, they're going to be 85. And that's starting to be a pretty vulnerable age. I'm not a big fan of aging in place. I think everybody should age in some kind of setting with others, close to others, maybe not in the same home with others, but close by. I'm a big fan of mobile home parks for that reason, just like cohousing communities. These tiny homes can be an answer for some people that don't have a lot of money. People sometimes ask me, well, what about these life plan communities? I love life plan communities. Those of us who own homes in the Bay Area are going to be able to sell those homes and move into a life plan community, and it's a good answer for solo agers. That's what my husband and I plan to do. Can I convince a lot of other people to do that? I can convince some, but we have a small cadre of friends that are planning on doing the same thing, all kind of looking for a community that we all like. But others falls on deaf ears. That whole aging in place thing that ARP perpetuated about 10 years ago has now just become part of what people think is their future. So trying to disabuse them of that idea it's an uphill battle. I think we have time for maybe one more question. If there's one out there, yes.
How do I, what are the key phrases I should look for if I want to refer somebody that, hey, you need to talk to Sarah, that these are the things and these are the problems she will solve for you? And do you actually do one-to-one consultations with people?
I don't solve problems, I raise awareness. And I don't do any one-on-one coaching anymore. I have to speak to a larger group of people if I'm going to get this message out there to enough people. So I speak to groups like this, professionals. I speak to groups of people who are aging. The only time I get paid to speak usually is when a life plan community or CCRC brings me in to actually talk to their prospects, because I'm singing their song. I think it's really important for people to age in community. So I do some of that as well. To support my other speaking. No. But anyway, no, I don't do the things that you're talking about. But there are people who do. One of the groups that I belong to is Retirement Coaches Association. When I left my previous career of organizational consulting about 12 years ago, and what I started doing at that point was retirement coaching. I went through a little program to get educated in psychologically what that retirement transition was like, and I took some gerontology classes and just started the whole learning process. And it led me into this area. So I used to do retirement coaching, and I now speak to retirement coaches about looking at it as a bigger palette. Because a lot of retirement coaches want to just coach people on, well, when you leave work, what are you gonna find to add meaning and purpose to your life? And that's important. That's the next important step. But I think retirement coaches should do more than that. I think they should be coaches for the future, coaches for aging, coaches for the rest of your life. So I push that agenda as well. I think we're probably out of time. Leslie, anything in the chat that we need to address? Okay. One more quick one.
Just one question. In your book, do you address retirement planning as a separate segment from solo aging or aging after you retire? Because to me, those seem like two separate concepts and events.
She's asking whether I address retirement, the retirement transition in the book, and I actually do. I talk a lot about how to make that transition and how to make that transition meaningful. And I apply it to solo agers, but it really applies to everyone. That's why a lot of the feedback I get about the book is that, well, it really applies to everybody. So, anyway. All right, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Sarah. So Sarah's going to be here for another, I think, 20 minutes before you need to skedaddle. She'll be up front with her books. So come up here. You can chat with her while she's kind of packing her stuff up as well. So for the next 20 minutes, feel free to speak with her. Otherwise, we've got some wonderful snacks and beverages from Bridgepoint. So help yourself to that, feel free. We're gonna be doing a raffle very shortly, so make sure that you get your business cards in the back. So this is a good time to get up and stretch your legs. Go ahead and mingle, and then we'll have the raffle in about 20 minutes.